All right, everyone. We're going to start a couple different series. We kind of finished engaging the mind, the body, and the soul last Sunday. And you can watch those videos. I think I put up 6, 4 on the mind, common Presbyterian, right? 1 on the body and 1 on the soul. And the mind kind of encompasses the Bible and theology and like devotional practices and how to read. So there's a lot of content in there. There's a short video on engaging the soul, just based on prayer. And there's a short video on there on the body, engaging your hands and your feet, your eyes and your ears, and kind of learning to sleep and to be engaged during the day and not just consuming streaming media 24/7, okay? So today, though, I'm going to start kind of a new series, and we're going to start 2 new series and kind of track along with these the next few weeks or however long we're kind of locked in and isolated. And I'm calling this series Teen and Christian, okay? And the Teen and Christian series is basically going to be trying to encourage you, teenagers and preteens, right where you are, with a couple issues that I think would be pertinent and helpful for you, and also some encouraging kind of just, ways to inspire you. And so it's hopefully to be a little bit inspirational and also very practical. So what am I going to do? This episode, I'm going to talk about some Christian biographies, people that should be inspiring to you, people that should be role models, I think, of our faith. And these are just people that are classic examples, so there are many others. And then we'll kind of talk about issues like bullying. We'll talk about issues like peer pressure. We'll talk about issues about identifying yourself with pop culture and things like that, or social media. We'll talk about things that are very relevant and practical to you. That's why I'm calling it Teen and Christian. That'll be the series, and I'll probably do 3 or 4 installments of that this week. And we'll also do another series called When I Was Your Age. And Liz and I are going to do that series. And we're going to try to talk to you about some of our teen experiences and the takeaways that we had, both negative and positive. Most of them were negative at the time, though some will be positive. And then you realize the more positivity of it as you get older, okay? So these 3 series, Engage in the Mind, Body, and Soul, Teen and Christian, and When I Was Your Age, hopefully they just kind of give you, you can listen to all of them if you want, but hopefully at least one of these will give you a niche to kind of fit into and track along with and be an encouragement to you during this time. So, Teen and Christian, the first episode of this one, first installment of this one, I'm just going to give you all a couple inspiring people to think about, to study, to read, and a little bit very quickly about their life. And I think I've got, I got 5, maybe 4. No, I got 5. 5 people that are classic inspirations of living a Christian life, and for different reasons, okay? And I'm going to go about them chronologically, okay? And of course, hello, there's books. Why not? I mean, just another reason, okay? There's lots of books, and, just to help you understand, books are better ways of communicating fact and fiction and nonfiction and literature than social media, than Wikipedia, okay? Please don't be getting your information off those sites, okay? Please be getting them off researched books by people that are qualified to teach and to give us history, people that are qualified with vocations to do these things. The quality is better. It's like the difference between back in the day when I was a kid, getting a 39-cent hamburger from McDonald's and getting really, I could say maybe the best $10 burger around at Louis Bar and Grill down the street. Very different. Both are burgers, but don't taste the same. Now, they cost differently too. But the reality is, one place is qualified to give you a burger. The other place is a bad substitute. I remember about 18 or 19 years old starting to recognize, why am I only spending less than $1 on a burger? Isn't that dangerous? And I started to recognize, yes, it is. From that point on, I never bought anything less than $1. Sorry, dollar store, my bad. Okay, so Christian biographies. Who should be someone that you should connect with that inspires you to live a Christian life? Because they had so many trials and tribulations and struggles themselves. So I'm going to take just a minute or 2 for each of these people and give you some encouraging people to kind of connect with. You don't need to connect with all these people, okay? These are kind of large titanic people in our Christian history. So you could just connect with one of them, that's plenty, okay? But if you're really into biographies and inspirational kind of books, you can get more than one, okay? The first one The man was alive in the 4th century, okay, and he, and a little bit after, and he struggled with lust. He struggled with being a womanizer. Goodness, man. So are we talking about something today, Ross? He struggled with not believing. He struggled with right and wrong. And he was not, he was your he was your typical teenager, okay? His mom prayed for him all the time to come to Christ. And he liked philosophy and cool ideas, but he never really submitted himself to the truth of Jesus Christ until a little bit later in his life when he met a man named Ambrose of Milan. This guy is Saint Augustine. Saint Augustine? What? He was a womanizer? He had lust problems? Yeah. Hello. I mean, all the passages in the Bible that say don't have sexual morality is because it's challenging, okay? This guy became a Christian later in his life. And this book is probably what most scholars would say is the first autobiography in history, at least that we have a copy of, okay? And St. Augustine's Confessions is both devotional, but also kind of a personal letter, autobiographical, of his own struggles. Many of them are academic struggles. Many of them are moral struggles. St. Augustine has a lot to teach us about living a Christian life as a teenager. A lot. He has a lot of struggles as a teenager actually in this book. Now, the book's a little bit more challenging, okay? There are probably kind of some whittled down diet versions of the Confessions that you could find, and I can get those for you. But this is the classic version. I think it's by Penguin Classics. Yeah, Penguin Classics does a lot of these cheap paperback books, $5 or $6, and they're really easy to find and easy to get a hand on. But it's the actual copy of it, so some of it might be a little bit more challenging. I would use it as devotional. I wouldn't use it just to read straight through. Okay, so the first great inspiration for teenagers, I think, is Saint Augustine himself. Saint Augustine of Hippo, and not hippopotamus like a zoo. Hippo as in a city in Africa, North Africa. Okay, the second guy I can identify with a lot. In fact, he's one of the Christians I identify the most with my life, and I don't mean in always a good way. I mean in a lot of times in a negative way. This guy was kind of a punk sometimes. He definitely had a temper on him. He was kind of an angry dude, kind of like Peter and Moses. However, God used him in a mighty way. He had tons of fear in his life. He had tons of anxiety in his life. Can you relate? He had fear and anxiety. He was always worrying about going to hell. I know some of you students have those kind of fears. But this guy God used mightily to change the course of the world. He's none other than the beard man, Martin Luther. I mean, this guy, that's kind of an amazing picture. And like, what a cool stash. Like, Josh Bowman could maybe compete with that guy, right? Maybe Scott Moore. Sam Chester, you're on your way, bro. This guy is incredible. He understands the fear and the anxiety of the question about who is God? And if God is true and just and righteous and holy and pure, oh man, that's not good for me because I'm none of those things. For the rest of us that are not delusional, which is pretty much all of us, we know we're sinners. We know we're sinners. I met this one kid in college one time. He didn't think he was a sinner. He thought he was perfect. He was delusional. He's the only completely delusional person I have ever met when it comes to that question, okay? The rest of us are terrified. We're full of fear. We're full of anxiety because of the situation of God's justice and our injustice, our inability to have righteousness consistently in our life. And Martin Luther, he met that question head on. He became a monk. He actually came out of the Augustinian tradition. He was part of an Augustinian monkery. And in that situation, he fled because he was trying to get his right life with God, and he was trying to do enough, pray enough, long enough. And there was times that he would be in his little convent room for days and days and days praying because he was trying to create enough penance, apology in his life to earn God's favor. Ooh, sounds good. The problem is, he could never shake guilt. He could never shake the lack of righteousness in his life. And then he started to read the book of Romans. He was a very intelligent man. He actually had a doctorate in law. You'll notice a similarity of another inspirational figure down the road. And this man turned his life over to Christ when he realized that God had done it all. He done it all through Jesus Christ. And it's a righteousness that he read in Romans 1 that comes by faith. And so his first commentary, really one of his most well-known, is a book called The Christian and the Freedom of the Christian, okay, from 1520. And you're going to read a little bit about that if you read a short little bio. I've got 2 books on him. The first one is a little bit more of a history book, very, very good. Actually just read this last year. Outstanding book. Not that hard to read. Really, really good. It's got a lot of pictures. Super, super good. And if you want to know a little bit more about the theology of Martin Luther, kaboom, Luther for Evangelicals. Who's an evangelical? Pretty much anyone who grew up believing in the Bible has some level of being an evangelical in them, okay? This is a good book to help you understand how Martin Luther is a little bit like us, but not always like us, and how we're different. So that's a little bit more of a theology book. This is the one I would recommend, the one by Heiko Obermann, with the super cool beard. And notice the subtitle of this book. Talk about drama, man. Netflix, hit this guy up. Man Between God and the Devil. I mean, what? That's craziness. Martin Luther, he was definitely a fascinating person. Not just, he's got a cool idea on getting saved. He's a lot more than that, okay? He's got tons of amazing things just about his life and his upbringing, okay? So that's the second guy I would recommend. He has a lot of impact upon my life. The third guy, I have kind of 2 books on his thinking. I need to find some better books on his biography, okay? And there's a few that are made for teens. I know Stephen Lawson has a good series on great thinkers for younger people. You could find that if you're interested in getting a bio on this guy. But he grew up wanting to be a lawyer. He was working towards becoming a lawyer. He actually was a humanist. People are like, what's that? A humanist is someone who believes that there's kind of a lot of capacity in people to kind of realize their potential. And so the world is not necessarily negative. And the world is just an untapped potential realm. And so humans are meant to kind of untap that potential, to realize it, to grow in it, and to help the world become, quote unquote, a better place. Okay, that's called humanism. Okay, very short and brief version of it. But this guy grew up a humanist. His father was a pastor. He wanted to be a lawyer. He wanted to help with law. He was from Geneva, Switzerland, and he was really focused on becoming a lawyer. And he was getting his doctorate in philosophy, getting a doctorate in law, and he was really focused on kind of being a Renaissance man. He was not averse to the faith, but he grew up Roman Catholic. And then he started to recognize through the ministry of William Farel and Martin Butzer and a few others, that he wanted to know who God was in a way that is without works, without kind of having to add to all these things. And he loved the church, but he saw the church corrupted. And he wanted the Bible to come and speak to uncorrupt the church and renew the church. And he went through a renewal himself prior to all this happens. He doesn't write a lot about it, but he actually wrote about it in the commentary he wrote on the Psalms, and came to faith in a very profound way. And the way he describes his conversion, that's kind of what we would call it, is he recognizes that his heart changed. He started to hunger for the Bible and God's truth and to know God in a way unparalleled. But then he also says, but I still wanted to say law and humanism and philosophy, but I just didn't have the same appetite anymore. That's how he talked about it. So it sounds like he got converted to me, and that was in the early 1530s, okay? His name is Jean Calvin. He's French, so we call him John Calvin. Jean Calvin was really his name. He was a Frenchman, and he wrote his famous book, The Institutes of the Christian Religion. This is the 1541 version. He wrote them as an apology, which means a defense of the faith, to Francis I in France. And he was trying to protect the Huguenot Christians, the Protestant Christians that were being persecuted in that area. So John Calvin, I would consider him top 2 Christian theologian of all time outside of the Scripture, for a lot of reasons. We won't get into that right now, but he is the number 2. The number 3. The fourth guy is, I think, probably the most misunderstood of the whole bunch, okay? Everyone thinks he's kind of like dour, and he's kind of mean. He's got a wig on, and so because of the wig, you think he's kind of like a bore. This guy is fascinating. He's probably the most brilliant thinker, maybe except for Calvin. He might be the most brilliant thinker in the group. And that's hard to say because you got St. Augustine, Martin Luther in there, and one other guy here in a second. But I think he's the most fascinating. He's also the most immediate in our context because he's from America. Okay? And he's got a name that sounds American. He was from the East. He was actually the president of Princeton Seminary for about 6 months before he died. He had a huge impact on the New England colonies, but he never traveled. He was a hermit, kind of. He stayed at home a lot. He enjoyed writing. I think he was on record in his biography of studying for 10 to 12 hours a day and writing in between breaks. This guy's a machine, you know? I would not say aspire to be like this guy. He probably didn't sleep well. He probably didn't have a lot of peace and relaxation in his life, okay? His name is Jonathan Edwards, okay? Jonathan Edwards, he's staring at you. Okay, Jonathan Edwards was probably the most famous, still is, had a little bit of a renewal in his influence the last 50 years. He is probably the most famous and deserves to be read a lot. And there's a lot of really good biographies of him. I've got like 4 or 5 in my office. This is a really good one if you want to read a little bit more in depth. I mean, look at that guy. He's a little bit thicker there. And it's written by Ian Murray, so Presbyterian guy. So 400 pages. But again, this is not hard reading. This is like history and nonfiction. This isn't hard. This is not studying or research-oriented reading or anything like that. So these are easy reads. They're just a little bit longer. And I would say his most famous book, I don't think it's his best book, but his most famous book that he's well known for is, boom, The Religious Affections. And basically what he's trying to say is he's trying to describe a Christian life. Okay, Jonathan Edwards was alive in the 18th century, so he's not that far removed from us. He had a huge influence on the idea of revival, bringing people to Christ, sometimes in some strange, unbiblical ways, but he was much more biblical than unbiblical, that's for sure. And he was well known also for being an incredible theologian. His thoughts of God and nature, what? His first writing was his little devotional and his journal. And at age 10, when he saw a spider, he was said that God must exist. Who talks like that? This is a fascinating person. He loved the natural sciences. He was scientific in his theology. He wanted to understand how the world worked. So he's someone who was very rational, okay, in his theology. However, he was also very imaginative and creative. He talked about God as the Trinity, and as the Trinity is having joy and life in himself, and his brilliance in who he is, it just shines forth as he loves himself in a perfect way from eternity past to the future. He overflows that love into the world and creates the world. It's like, what? So this guy is amazing as a thinker. I think there's much in his life to be emulated, okay? And chronologically last is my favorite theologian, though I don't think he's the best theologian of the group. I think he is by far my favorite theologian because his life is at least or more interesting somehow than his theology. His life is fascinating. His life was right in the middle of all the junk that built up to World War II, and he lived through it almost to the very end. He was a martyr for the faith. None of these other men were actually martyrs. He died for his belief, even though he died because of an assassination attempt that was controversial. I think still is controversial. I don't think I would agree with how he went about that. However, I didn't live when he lived, and I wasn't in that circumstance, so I don't know what I would have done, okay? But I think as someone who's observing, unfortunately, that's all I can do, I don't think I would have handled it quite the way he handled it. But again, fascinating life, maybe even more fascinating than actually his theology, which I think his theology is revolutionary, just to be honest. So his name is Dietrich Bonhoeffer, okay? And he was alive from 1906 to 1945. Wasn't very old when he died, 39 years old when he died. He has an incredible output of literature and theology. He actually wrote poetry. He actually wrote a drama while he was in prison in Flossenburg, Germany. He's a fascinating person. He's someone who did not become a Christian until actually after he was a theologian. That's so weird. There's a lot of people that are Christian ministers that don't believe in Jesus. Isn't that weird? What? It's just a job for them, okay? So for Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he was more interested in being a theologian, kind of an academic religious studies expert, than actually a follower of Jesus. He didn't really believe in that until he visited a church in New York City called Abyssinian Baptist Church. And as he was worshiping there through the Gospels, the Negro spirituals from the period of slavery and afterwards, as he was hearing God's word preached, he said he had never heard it preached in such an effective and arresting way in his entire life. He said that the German churches and the other churches in New York were basically impoverished compared to this church. And I think that's probably when he became a Christian. And he wrote about it when he went back to Germany and said, I went from, he calls it the phraseological. I think he meant from theory into what is real. He went from theoretical to practical. He went from the idea of academy to church, okay? So Dietrich Bonhoeffer went to church and he came out a Christian, okay? It's fascinating. And in that period, the early 30s, he came back to Germany. He set up a seminary that was against the Nazis at the time. He trained about 30 to 40 men for about 3 or 4 years. He wrote 2 books in that period, and he wrote many after that, and he wrote many before that. But he wrote 2 books that I think are classics that I want to commend to all of you that come out of his life. These are not abstract thoughts. This is living theology, because God is a living God. And the best book, in fact, I would call this book top 5 all-time Christian books, is Discipleship by Dietrich Bonhoeffer. This book is entrancing. It's convicting to a point that you're like, should I be convicted that much? And there is a power in God's writing through his people that sometimes you're just like, who is this person? And this book is similar to that. Some of you that don't really understand Bonhoeffer theology very much, you're just not going to appreciate it. When you start to understand and you start to read and you start to get the quality, you will understand what I'm talking about, okay? This book is readable, okay? It doesn't mean that you're going to understand it right away, but the book is readable. He starts off by giving 3 or 4 chapters basically on the difference between cheap grace and costly grace, between discipleship and basically just ritual, okay? Then he goes into a very long discussion on the Sermon on the Mount, which is Jesus' words, chapter 5 through 7 of Matthew. Then he goes on and he finishes up with a discussion of the church, okay, of communion and of service and sacrifice and some of those things. So these 5 people, I think one of them at least could be an inspiration to you. St. Augustine, the 3rd and 4th century, okay? Martin Luther from the early 1500s, early 16th century. John Calvin, just a generation later, 1530s to 1570s, okay? After that, Jonathan Edwards from the 18th century, so later 18th century in northeastern America. And then lastly, Dietrich Bonhoeffer from Germany in the continental Europe period of the Second World War and his martyrdom for the faith and living for Christ and learning to follow Jesus into the world, as he says. So any one of these folks should be an inspiration to you. So that's our first episode of Teen and Christian, and we'll go ahead and sign off and start off with that one, okay?